Good morning, everyone. It is with great pleasure that Universidad Santo Tomás and the English Teaching Program welcome all of you to this seminar called Issues in Language Teaching and Learning, which will be given by three international guest speakers. Professor Svetlana Baluyan from the Southern Federal University in Russia, Professor María Moreno from Universidad de Granada in Spain, and Professor Yulia Privalova from the Southern Federal University in Russia. We will also have the participation of one of our own academics from the English Teaching Program, Professor Patricia Vulcano. After these three presentations, we will hold a plenary session in which participants may ask questions to our presenters. Please turn off your mobile devices during presentations. We would also like to welcome the authorities that chair this event, Mr. Ezequiel González, Chancellor of Universidad Santo Tomás Santiago, Ms. Paulina Ditborn, the Dean of the School of Education, Professor Ana Maria Wee, Head of the English Teaching Program, and all professors and students from our university and other institutions. Thank you all for being here. Our first speaker, Patricia Vulcano, is an academic in our English Teaching Program. She is originally from Argentina, where she developed her teaching career and completed professional development for over 20 years. Her educational background includes a degree in translation and a degree in teaching English and English literature, granted by La Plata National University in Argentina. She also holds an MA in TEFL from the Universidad of Jaén, Spain. She joined the UST English Teaching Program in 2006, where she has remained a language lecturer with a special interest in writing. Let's give a warm welcome to our Professor Patricia Vulcano.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this seminar. Well, as you see, the topic of this talk is approaches to writing. Okay. Let me tell you what this will be about. There will be a brief introduction to the topic. Then we will devote some time to trying to understand what writing involves. Then we're going to see a brief overview of traditional versus more modern perspectives in writing, the writing process and its pedagogical implications. Then we'll try to put all this puzzle together, as you will see. And, of course, there will be concluding remarks and the corresponding references. Well, let's start by the premise that writing is easy. What do you think? Would you say that writing is easy? No? Does anybody believe that writing is easy? Okay. But there are people who believe that, okay? Look, someone said, writing is easier. All you do is stare at a black sheet of paper until drops of blood form on your forehead, like here in Snoopy. See, like, sweating blood. Don't you feel identified with that? It might sound a little bit exaggerated, but sometimes that's the feeling that students, maybe, even teachers feel when they have to produce a piece of writing. This quotation comes from Jim Fowler, who was an American journalist. Okay. Now, but why bleeding? Why should we bleed? If it said that writing is simply the act of expressing what we think and saying what we mean. Okay. Why do texts that express what the writer meant often fail to communicate the same meaning to the reader? That's a big concern. Okay. Now, the thing is that writing involves more than self-expression. Writing involves generating and organizing ideas. Okay? Sometimes people lack ideas. They don't have ideas. Okay? Or if they have them, they don't know how to organize them. Another point is that those ideas need to be translated into readable text. The reader needs to understand what has been written, the meaning of what has been written. And last but not least, there are many other complex aspects of the linguistic system, right, that make writing more complicated, like spelling, punctuation, word choice, grammar aspects, syntax, so on and so forth. Now, it is important to focus on two of the most significant qualities associated with a person's capacity to write successfully. One of them is the extent to which a writer is able to draw on a range of processes, appropriate processes, when he or she is engaged in the creation of texts. Here I'm going to make a point of this word, processes. We're going to work a lot on that word later, okay? And the other important quality is to which extent can, how much does the writer know? I mean, what types of knowledge does he have to be able to provide the right context and the right content, and how this influences the different forms of writing that are typical of particular events. This wording might sound a bit complicated, but we're going to explain it with examples. If you notice, here we are referring to writer's knowledge. There are different types of knowledge. Knowledge has been categorized into 4 different ways, which I will show you now. And as you know, this one is called content knowledge. The other is context knowledge. We also have the language system knowledge and the writing system knowledge. Now let's go one by one to see if we can understand this better. In the first case, content is the knowledge of the concepts involved in the subject area. So this determines, for instance, is the content in a business letter won't be the same as the content in a report for a company, or a report for maybe one of your teachers here at the university, or an essay that you have to write. So it is important to determine what sort of content you need to develop your text. Now, the context is very, very important, because this has to do with the audience and purpose involved in what you need to write, okay? The language system, of course, has to do with all the elements we need to create the text, okay? All the aspects of the language, like grammar, syntax, the appropriate vocabulary, depending on, as I say, the type of text that you need to compose. And finally, the writing system knowledge has to do with the processes that you need to create that text. It happens that there are texts that need more or less process, okay? If we think of a report, for instance, usually reports have a predetermined format. So there you follow a few tips, and if you know the language, you just write it down. Whereas if you need to develop an essay, which is a big concern, and I say essays because I know that many of you are now going through that painful task of writing essays, okay? And it's a requirement in most colleges and universities. This needs more of a process here. So the writing system knowledge has to do with the compositional skills that are needed, okay? Now, let's see a little bit of the history. I mean, to make a long story short, I have only selected some periods, right? Because this can be traced back to the Greek and Roman times, okay? Believe it or not, in those times, they had the idea of process, okay? We think that process is one of the movements some of you might be familiar with, was invented or appeared somewhere in the 70s. No, I mean, this can be traced back to even those times, okay? What we may say is that here in the 70s, writing was not really seen as a skill. in itself. As we say, okay, we have the famous 4 skills: reading, speaking, listening, and writing. But writing was just taken as a support skill. It was even called the Cinderella of other skills because it did the dirty job, you know. And that came up from the audiolingual method, mainly thinking that in the audiolingual method they think that you learn through habit formation. Okay, it's the behaviorist view of learning things. So in those days, writing was just that, mainly producing maybe sentences, maybe caring about punctuation. It was a support skill in terms of doing a dictation, you know, following certain patterns, and not more than that. Now, gradually, this started to change because, of course, teachers and researchers realized that that was not enough. And they moved from strictly controlled writing, as it happened in the 70s, to something which was a bit more guided, and in which there was a little bit of more flexibility, in which error was started to be accepted, because whereas in the 70s, error was like a bad word. I mean, students could not make mistakes, right? And we all know, I think, by now, that mistakes are part of learning, okay? Sometimes we have to make mistakes to learn things. Then in the late 80s, came up this sort of boom of the process movement. But as I said, there's nothing new under the sun. But it's when the word process started to appear here and there, mainly in the United States, also in New Zealand, right? Canada, and in the UK in some cases. But the big movement was produced in the United States, okay? And they started to do that with native speakers, okay? And then this was done with in English as a second language classes, right? Now, in the case of process, then we'll see it in more detail, but I just can tell you, and those who have experienced it know that in process writing, students are supposed to be more autonomous, okay? And the teacher should be a facilitator in the process and should be helping, as well as other peers in this case. I mean, the process writing approach promotes exchange with peers, okay? And evaluation does not come only from the teacher, but from their own peers or the reader, whoever he or she is. Okay, finally, in the 21st century, a more balanced perspective here, okay? They noticed that they couldn't go to extremes, that they had to reach a happy medium. And as classes became more learner-centered and they became a social activity, a balance between product and process was sort of found. Although there are many controversies, there have been reactions against product and against process. Okay, it's not so easy. It was not easy to find, as I say, a happy medium. Now, just for you to have an idea, let's go to extremes for a while. Okay, then we'll see if we can find a balance. If you take product writing, you're going to notice that usually what students do is imitate the model text only. They imitate it, while in the case of process writing, the text is only a resource for comparison, but it's not mere imitation. Yes? This is important. We said at the beginning that writing means organizing ideas, right? But also generating them. Not only organizing them, generating them. So in the case of product writing, the organization is more important than the ideas themselves, which is a bit crazy, right? Whereas in the process, the ideas are the starting point. So in process writing, ideas are more important at the beginning than the organization itself. The organization comes throughout a different steps that we will see and we will revise in a few minutes. As we said before, in product writing, the practice is very controlled. Maybe people they are given patterns to follow. There's nothing much that the student can do by himself or herself. Okay, has to follow those patterns and feels sort of structured. Whereas in the case of process writing, this is more global. It focuses on purpose and theme, the type of text. Okay, and the reader is more emphasized. Here again, the importance of the audience should be highlighted, because usually we say, okay, who do we write for? The teacher, to give us a mark. Yes, we should try to move a little bit beyond that. The idea would be that the reader is maybe a classmate, or if you can publish something you write in a blog, or, I mean, there are ways in which writing can be shared. Okay, it can be, as I say, evaluated, but not for art. Okay, evaluated in terms of giving an opinion, giving positive reinforcement of what the students are doing. Back to the product writing, it's individual. It's a very lonely task. Okay, whereas in process writing is collaborative. That means that you are allowed to share throughout the whole process. Right? Obviously, the emphasis in product writing is the product. Okay, it has to be correct, and what matters is that it's only one draft submitted for evaluation, and that's it. Whereas in process writing, there is an emphasis on all the creative process. What happens since we start brainstorming ideas up to the very end, when we edit and hopefully publish what we write. Okay, and when I mean publish, it doesn't mean that we have to publish it, you know, in a publishing company. Great if we can do that, but let's be realistic. Publishing means sharing somehow with the readers in whatever way you think can be possible within, in this case, an academic context, okay, in the university. Okay. Now, we've been talking about process. I'm going to focus a little bit on process because I'm very interested in that. Some of you who know me know that I insist a lot on this. Although process cannot be used with everything, process is important. Let's start by giving a definition, okay? Just to remember, what is the process? We can define it. I mean, this is taken from a dictionary. I didn't invent this, okay? It's a definition taken from the dictionary. It says a series of actions directed to achieving a result or condition, okay? A series of actions could be a series of steps. You can call them steps, right? A method of producing or doing something. Now, as I said, in writing, we follow different steps. And there are different beliefs about the steps involved. Okay, different authors have thought of different ways of naming the steps, but after all, they all mean the same. Okay, some may add some more names, but we cover from the pre-writing stage through composing or drafting, which in a way is the same thing, right? Revising, editing, and publishing. So from pre-writing to publishing, you notice there are several steps. Then we will explain them in more detail, and we will say what is done in each step. But this is mainly for you to see that one of the proposals is to show that the process is linear. That we start by brainstorming, okay, whatever way, then we write a first draft, then we make a revision of that through peer correction, with teacher's help, whatever, then we edit for mistakes, for reorganizing ideas one more time, and finally publishing. But if you notice, the first proposal was linear. In fact, this is not really the truth. Because in the process, we can go backwards and forwards as many times as we feel it is necessary. So sometimes believing that the writing process is linear is a misconception. Okay? Because we are allowed to do that. It's not that, okay, I did the brainstorming and I cannot go back to that. All right? Or I wrote a first draft and I cannot write 2 or 3 more drafts. Okay? Sometimes because of time constraints is that people write perhaps 2 drafts. But if they could write 3, 4 drafts, it would be ideal. All right? I'm going to show you another diagram where you will find similar terms. The next diagram that you're going to see is more complete, all right? And you will see how, you can move from one step to the other freely. Look at this. Where would you start here? What is the first thing that happens? Think. Would you start by drafting, by focusing, by doing what?
Ideas.
Generating, right? Good. Analysis would be, although we can move, okay, I said, okay, this is flexible, but we cannot start by evaluating, okay? Let's have common sense. We will start by generating ideas. Now, how do we generate ideas? There are many ways. Probably the most well-known word is brainstorming. This belongs to the pre-writing stage that we named before. Okay, brainstorming can be done in many ways. Okay, there are people who feel comfortable doing spidergrams. Those spidergrams. You put a word in the middle and then you start, or mind maps. Okay, that's one possible way. Another way is listing ideas. Okay, another way is free writing. Whatever comes to your mind, like the flow of consciousness. You write down, and then there will come a moment when you will be able to select and organize those ideas. Okay, so first you need to have the ideas. This can be done alone, if you want it to be a lonely work, or you can do it even with your classmates. Maybe there's a project involved in class, and you need to generate ideas for a certain topic. So why not brainstorming all together, right? And from there, then individually, perhaps you will pick the ideas that you feel more comfortable with, right? So the starting point should be generating these ideas. Now, those ideas, of course, at the very beginning might be a little bit mixed up, okay? And we need to sort of organize them. So we structure them. We start by making lists, by deciding what's relevant, what's irrelevant, okay? All right. Then we may move to drafting because, okay, brainstorming can be never ending, but there should be a moment when we should decide to cut and say, okay, at least we should have some provisional text to get started, okay? Once you have a first draft, you will need to focus and say, okay, I am going around the main idea or getting away from it, because sometimes that happens, all right? We're very eager to write something, we're very enthusiastic, but there becomes a moment when we get mixed up. So focusing is important, right? And then say, okay, you revise that. Reviewing, as you notice, is in the middle because you can review at any moment. You can review your brainstorming, your ideas, while you are generating them, while you're structuring them, or after you have produced the first draft, maybe. Yes. Now, evaluating. That's a word that we all associate with marking, don't we? But in this case, it means another thing. Evaluating means having the view of the reader. And that is, if we have the chance to do what we call peer correction, okay? Another classmate will read your text, okay? You exchange text, and the idea will be not to say, okay, you forgot the S in this verb. No, evaluating is not just correcting spelling mistakes or grammar mistakes. It goes beyond that. That can help, of course, but that's the last step. That's editing, okay? So while you're evaluating, you're trying to help the reader see if he really is getting the message across. Remember that we state that the text, the ideas should be turned into readable text. So the reader needs to understand what your focus is. And sometimes we are very convinced that we are transmitting an idea, but when we give it to someone else to read, we say, no, I really don't get what you want to say. So there is when you can go backwards. And it's not a sin to do that, okay? You can go backwards and rethink what your main idea is. Of course, teachers evaluate, definitely. But at this point, they should be seen as a support, okay? They should guide the students throughout the whole process. And if we talk about evaluation in terms of, okay, we have to give a mark to students, okay, we need to see the whole process. From the very beginning, we need to evaluate from brainstorming up to publishing, not just the final product. We need to see what happened in the middle, how the text progressed in terms of quality, you know, and finally, the reviewing includes what we call editing, and there we can edit for. Of course, for mistakes such as spelling, punctuation, capitalization, but we can also see if we need to add more linking words, for instance, more transitions to make the text more fluent, more dynamic, more understandable, okay? Imagine you're writing an argumentative essay. You will need a lot of linking words to show your arguments, if you're for, if you're against, whatever, or if you are contrasting ideas, right? So if you notice, you have the possibility to move from one step to the other with certain flexibility. That's an agreement you have to make with your teacher. Not all the teachers perhaps will allow you to do that, but ideally, I mean, you can move from one step to the other, all right, more freely. Now, we've been talking about writing. We are involved in a teaching and learning environment, so we should say something about the pedagogical purposes of writing. Why do we write? Do we write for a mark? Right? Well, ideally, okay, writing is a way of communication, isn't it? Speaking is another way of communication. Writing means communicating ideas in a clear and fluent way. Yes? For that, we may revise the elements of communication, right? So some of you may have seen these concepts in linguistics, yes, in your linguistic courses. And in the writing course, we have said a word or two about it. So we need to create a text, okay? We have to give a message to someone through a written text. If it's a report, a letter, an essay, whatever. We need an addresser, which in this case is the writer, okay, who will transmit this message to the addressee, which in this case is the reader, okay? Within an appropriate context, all right, we need to consider what sort of reader is going to read our text, okay? And also what's the purpose of writing this text through a linguistic method, okay? Now, to be able to achieve successful communication, we're talking about this case, teaching. I mean, we can resort to this word, scaffolding. You know what it means? Some of you probably know because of your methodology classes, but some others perhaps don't know the word. You know that when a building is being built, they put scaffolding around to sort of support the structure? Right? So, well, the word comes from there in a way. I mean, if you can picture that, you know, you're trying to support the structure so that it doesn't fall down. So, scaffolding here means all the help that can be given to, in this case, to the student to be able to compose their text. And that comes through the instructional materials, okay, which can be texts, activities that are given for reinforcement sometimes of certain grammatical structures. It could be resorting to other skills, because writing is not a lonely skill. It has to be integrated with other skills like listening, okay? Like reading, you can get input from reading and listening. You learn vocabulary, right? And then you can hopefully internalize new words, new structures, and you can use them in your writing pieces. Okay? And of course, although it's not the main idea, if we think of writing per se, I mean, learning to write, okay? Through writing, of course, you will be consolidating the language system, okay? We say that, okay, maybe your grammar will become better, your spelling will become better, your organizations of paragraphs, for instance, will become better and more clear. Well, this was a puzzle, okay? We'll see if we can put all this puzzle together in the following way. We said that writing means communicating ideas in a clear and fluent way. Right? So the center here is communication, in this case through written text. We're going to see if we can build some sort of cake. Right? We're going to see half the cake first. Let's start by the focus on composing, on creating. Right? What we need is the appropriate content. It has to be relevant, specific, logical. All right? That's one of the elements. We need to be sure what type of genre we are dealing with. Okay? Is it, as I say, a report, a letter, an essay? Because not all the genres need the same sort of knowledge. Remember that we talked about knowledge? Another thing is the writer's process. All these steps that you have seen, all that is part of the composing process, okay? From pre-writing to publishing. The audience, very important. Who will read my text, okay? And the purpose, why am I writing this? So this is half the cake, which focuses on composing. But we said that we needed some scaffolding, right? Well, let's see the other half. This is the focus on language. We need syntax. We need to know about sentence structures, word order, those things that drive you crazy, I know. Okay. Grammar, okay, verb tenses, prepositions, parts of speech. Mechanics, right? Spelling, capitalization, even handwriting sometimes, okay? Punctuation. Organization, and this has to do with how you connect paragraphs, how you organize a paragraph. Does it have a topic sentence? Does it have supporting sentences? Okay, how do we organize paragraphs within a longer text? Okay. Word choice, right? The type of vocabulary you will need, depending on the type of text that you are trying to compose. And well, now comes some concluding remarks. As we have noticed, there's not only one approach to writing. The approach to writing will depend on what you need to write. But they share something in common. We should consider that in the clear and fluent communication of ideas, that this one needs to be taken into account to know what, how to organize it and what type of language we need. Writing should be produced in social and cultural context. It should become a social activity. Okay. Both process and product are important depending on the type of writing. We don't want to go to extremes. We said that we were trying to find, to reach a happy medium, okay? There's a focus on composing, as you notice on the right half of the cake, and there's also a focus on language on the other half, and scaffolding, which will be helping this cake not to fall down. Also, we insisted on the fact that if we believe that writing is a social activity and if we need to share with others, you have to do work in collaboration. There will be a moment when you will perhaps be writing your own final draft by yourself. But in the meantime, I mean, throughout the whole process, well, you have been collaborating with others, others have been collaborating with you. And now, please don't bleed, okay? We started saying that writing for many people means bleeding. I mean, we shouldn't be bleeding. What we need is patience, be self-disciplined, and, well, you know, this famous proverb that Rome was not built in a day, but it was built. So it's not impossible, all right? You will find many obstacles, probably, going through all this process, which I know sometimes is painful, but you have to be very persevering, okay? So I hope that by the end of the process you can make it, okay? Thank you so much.
The English teaching program would like to express their gratitude for Professor Vulcano's presentation. Second speaker, Svetlana Baluyan, is a professor from the Southern Federal University in Russia. Her educational background includes a specialist degree in EFL teaching from Pyatigorsk State Teachers Training Institute of Foreign Languages, a candidate of pedagogy degree from Tambov State University, and a doctorate degree in pedagogy from the Linguistics University at Nizhny Novgorod in 2010. Since 1992, she's been working at the Department of Linguistics, where she became a professor in 2012. In 2003, she was awarded an academic status. Ms. Baluyan's primary research interests are language testing and educational assessment, and history of language testing. In 1997, she was awarded a grant from IREX, International Research and Exchanges, to conduct her research at the English Department of Iowa State University, USA. She was recently awarded with the title of honor, the Honorary Educationalist of Higher Professional Education of Russia, for her contributions to higher education development in Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Svetlana Baluyan.
Buenos dias. I am Svetlana Baluyan, and in my today's presentation, I'm hoping to give you an overview of language testing development in the USA. It is the topic of my research. Language testing, a subfield within applied linguistics, is useful to view from a historical perspective. The early history of language testing has relevance to present-day perspective. Have to see how it works. Okay. Modern tests didn't appear all of a sudden. They evolved very slowly from a great number of precursors introduced over the last 100 years and even earlier. I'd like to start by asking and answering some questions. The first one is, why have I chosen historical research? Because I like detective stories. Well, and I can feel like a real history detective conducting this kind of research. Historical research can help us to see where we came from, how what we do today is connected with the past. Understanding this can show us a new perspectives for the future development. The next question, what does it mean to conduct historical research? I want to present in the most popular testing format. What is this format? Do you know? The most popular testing format. Multiple choice. Yeah. Multiple choice, which has become customary in various fields, from university entrance examinations for, let us say, to the popular television program Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. By the way, do you have this program in Chile? Yeah. So, this is the question. Examining the past of language testing means A, to investigate the unknown documented facts and answer questions. Identify the relationship that the past has to the present. Record and evaluate accomplishments of individuals and institutions. Understand the relationship among different events. Find out what determined changes in testing methods. For this testing item, there are no distractors. All the answers are correct. Above all, carrying out historical research, you must think like a real detective. Learn to quickly size up the quality of information and cross-examine your sources. In short, become Sherlock Holmes. Well, so the guiding objective of the research is to examine the question of how language testing evolution has been determined by the changing view of language, as well as the historical and cultural events, and relate current developments in the field to what has preceded them. Today, we'll scrutinize only the most important pages from the history of modern language testing in the United States, the country where language testing appeared at the turn of the 20th century, and which is obviously the most tested country in the world. The institutional history of foreign language testing in the US has been investigated and documented by many researchers. Yes. What's happening? No idea. It doesn't work. But many questions still remain. Yeah, thank you. Remain to be answered. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So researchers of the history of language testing attempted to categorize collected information, that is, to divide time into periods with relatively stable characteristics. However, determining the precise beginning and ending to any period is often arbitrary, and all systems of periodization are more or less arbitrary to the extent that history is continuous and ungeneralizable. Yet, without named periods, however inaccurate, past time would be nothing more than scattered events without framework to help us understand them. In general, three main trends can be distinguished within the history of language test development. However, their nomenclature and even their underlying meaning differs according to different scholars. What's wrong with it? Okay, so Bernard Spolsky identified three periods of language testing: the pre-scientific, the psychometric structuralist, and the psycholinguistic sociolinguistic. Later, in subsequent papers, he reviewed his nomenclature and referred to them as the traditional period, the modern, and the postmodern period. Although Polsky has since offered an alternative view of the development of language testing, his original phases are widely accepted and frequently cited by the researchers in the field. The next is Francis Butler Hinofortis. He has labeled the testing trend into the pre-scientific period, the psychometric structuralist period, and the integrative social linguistic period. The next, Harold Madsen, considered that the evolution ranged from the intuitive era to the scientific era, reaching to the communicative era of truth testing. The next, Cyril Weir, has called the different trends within the history of language testing the psychometric structuralist era, the psycholinguistic social linguistic era, and the communicative approach to language testing. James Dean Brown has used the term movements instead of periods or years to describe them because they somehow overlap chronologically and coexist today in different parts of the world. I tend to support his point of view on the term movements, though in my research I suggested my own view on the periods, and I'll use this structure to put you in the picture of language testing history in the United States. Well, the history of language testing can be traced back a long way. Testing, in its broader sense, has been part of everyday life of people for centuries throughout the history of mankind. Probably, the next one, probably the first evidence is found in the Old Testament, in the book of Judges, chapter 12, when the Gileads or Gileadites, whose dialect included sh phoneme, used the pronunciation of the Hebrew word shibolet, it means ear or stream, torrent, to distinguish between friends and enemies. Ephraimites, whose dialect lacked a sh phoneme. This story also indicates that in testing, there is always a standard people are expected to meet. In this case, it was the standard of being able to pronounce the word shibboleth correctly. No, the previous. Oh, okay.
Previous?
No, it's just, let it be this one. However, the history of modern language testing is relatively young. Language testing took its present form from the 18th century examination in Cambridge, known as Cambridge Tripos. It didn't rely on a linguistic theory and was characterized by the use of essays, open-end examinations, or oral examining with the results determined intuitively by an examiner. So let's start with the early years, the old type tests period. The next one. In the United States, it was not until the closing years of the 19th century that language testing was incorporated into educational practice. At that time and earlier in the Western world, foreign language learning was associated with the learning of Latin and Greek, which meant focusing on grammatical rules, syntactic structures, rote memorization of vocabulary. The skill exercised was reading and translation. Languages were taught for the sake of creating an illusion of erudition. There was no provision for any listening or speaking practice, and very little attention was placed on pronunciation or any communicative aspects of the language. Late in the 19th century, the classical method came to be known as the grammar translation method. Examinations were characterized by lack of concern for statistical considerations or for objectivity and reliability, and were known as old the old type of format. It means that one can and must rely completely on the subjective judgment of an experienced teacher, who can identify by intuition what mark to give the student in order to specify the related language ability. In 1875, Harvard College began to offer admission examinations in the modern languages. The entrance test in French consisted of a passage to be translated into English, a few separate sentences to be translated from English into French, and finally some grammar questions that focused on verb conjugation. In 1878, the New York Regents examination in French for high school students was inaugurated. It consisted of similar tasks. In the later years of the century, there was no uniformity between universities. To improve the situation, in 1896, the Modern Language Association created a committee to study existing conditions of modern language teaching and make recommendations in syllabi and teacher training. The report of this committee, known as the Committee of 12, has a special place in the history of language testing because it offered some specimen examinations in French and German for college entrance. The tests offered show what was considered to be good testing practice at the turn of the century. For example, the elementary French examination consisted of translation to and from French and the influence of the study of classical languages was patent. Here are some of the passages to be translated. And the next one, the questions on French grammar, in the main were based on the texts translated. And intermediate and advanced French exams were similar. The German examinations were even more grammar-oriented. These examinations responded to the primary goals of language learning of the time. Students were expected to know about the language rather than to know the language. Many language teachers were not satisfied by the format of examinations. Teachers who wished to follow innovative methodologies of the time, such as phonetic method or the natural method, abandoned their plans, knowing that their students would have to pass an examination that was based on a formalistic and literary view of language. In 1917, Albert Merat published an analysis of French examinations set by American universities. 98% demanded translation from the French. Other formats were dictation, questions on reading, and free compositions. Merat declared himself opposed to this type of tests. He offered alternative formats for testing, such as rewriting sentences or passages or filling in gaps. In his tests, we can see the beginning of the concept of language testing as a discrete activity and translation from the old type test to the new type tests, in keeping with a general explosion of interest in psychological and pedagogical testing of all kinds. Next one. So, here we are moving to the second period, the first decade of which became known as the testing wave. Most historians trace the beginning the beginnings of testing on scientific basis to the experimental investigation of individual differences in Germany and Great Britain in the late 19th century. There is no doubt that early experimentalists such as Wundt, Galton, Kettle laid the foundations for modern-day testing, studying the sensory discrimination, motor skills, and reaction time in labs. The interest in language testing, in foreign language testing, was in keeping with a general explosion of interest in psychological and pedagogical testing of all kinds, as I already mentioned. The First World War became a kind of catalyst for the testing boom in the 1920s and gave impetus to the great movement in language testing. The growing demand for soldiers with foreign language skills caused Army to develop the Army Alpha tests based on the work of psychological testers such as Arthur Otis and Robert Yerkes as a tool to measure people's linguistic abilities. Very important in this test was the work of Frederick Kelly, the inventor of the multiple choice test, first introduced in 1915 in his silent reading test. Kelly's format permitted testing to be carried out on a vast scale. Tests could be quickly and easily scored by low-level clerical workers. It came to define the entire educational system of the United States. Next year, in 1916, a series of language tests was published by Charles Starch as part of his book Educational Measurements. The examination consisted of two parts, a vocabulary test and a translation test. The vocabulary part had a new format. Students were provided with two lists of 100 words, one in English, taken at random from a dictionary, and the other in the target language. They had to match each foreign word with its English equivalent. This work had little influence, and foreign language testing had to wait some time before taking its great leaps forward. The first standardized modern language test was Charles Hanshin's silent reading test in French and Spanish. The French test included a paragraph with 10 questions to be answered in either English or French, and a comprehension and grammar test based on completions and inflections. Hanshin may deserve the title of America's first foreign language tester, for he was the first person to think in terms of general principles of testing and look to experimental results. This test was followed by Vivian Henmon's French test of vocabulary and sentence translation in 1921. He used the format of all type tests, but an attempt was made to control the level of difficulty of the vocabulary, with words being taken from first-year texts. Scoring could be carried out by a simple count or by using weighted scores on the basis of supposed levels of difficulty. Testers didn't attempt to assess the spoken language. Only in 1915, the State University of New York instituted examinations for oral credit to be given to prospective foreign language teachers, with such tasks based on the text provided. Can you show these tasks? The next one. Let me see. It's, no, I think it's, No. Well, this is the oral task. The only aspect of true oral expression in the early 1920s was a pronunciation. It was French pronunciation that was tested. German and Spanish pronunciation were ignored. In the general enthusiasm for testing in all subjects, it was common for enormous numbers of students to be tested on the same day. One vast project in modern language was undertaken in New York City. Experimental new type tests designed by Ben Wood, professor at Columbia College, were administered to tens of thousands of high school students. Each test took 90 minutes. Just an example, the next. Wood believed that these tests represented a fundamental improvement over old-style translation or composition tests. They were the products of sustained work in pre-testing and norming over a long period. Wood's statistical treatment was the first published use of detailed item analysis in evaluating a foreign language test. These tests were widely used and influential for perhaps 2 decades afterwards. Wood's research was but a part of an even wider and more ambitious project. Between 1924 and 1927, a massive study of the state of foreign language education was carried out in the United States and Canada. The papers of the study provide invaluable insight into the state of the art in many areas of foreign language teaching in the mid-1920s. According to Vivian Hanmon's report, at least 9 separate foreign language skills existed and needed to be tested. The next one, these 9 skills. The Modern Foreign Language Study Committee only succeeded in developing tests on 4 of these: vocabulary, reading, grammar, and composition. The study produced 16 standardized foreign language tests in French, German, Spanish, and Italian, more than all those previously available. Of course, I could give much more descriptions of the tests of the 1920s as they began to appear with amazing frequency, but most of them looked like those mentioned above. One of the striking aspects of the foreign language testing boom of the 1920s is that language teachers and testers worked in isolation with linguists. They didn't try to research the nature of language and didn't know much about what it is that is being tested. That was the great weakness of the testing pioneers. Thus, within the bounds of the pre-scientific period, the old type tests gave way to new type ones. The instruments that had already been created for standardized tests, such as those for intelligence, were applied to the language classroom. True, false, multiple choice, matching, completion, correct the error, rearrangement formats ensured higher reliability and the ease and economy of tests. Test grading in the situation of rapid increase in number of students in schools and in universities. The next one is the Depression decade. Let's take a look at the 1930s, when the environment for foreign language research was no longer supportive. And there was a decline in language testing development. The pioneering work of the 1920s lost strength. Undoubtedly, one factor in this was the economic depression. 25,000 teachers had lost their jobs, though 1 million more pupils had come into the schools. Though in the 1930s, were thus a time of limited innovation in language teaching and testing, some use was made of the test produced in the previous decade. The creation, the creation of new standardized language tests slowed somewhat, though one exception to this trend was provided by the cooperative test service. So-called cooperative tests constructed by the experts throughout the country in the 1930s remained popular for decades. Ben Wood, an important figure in setting up the cooperative testing service, continued his contributions to testing through his work on the creation of a machine for scoring tests. In 1928, Wood was made a consultant to IBM, which was already seeking to design a test scoring machine. In 1935, the IBM model of this machine finally came on the market, and first commercial test as a first test scoring machine. So, in the decade preceding the Second World War, stagnation in economy caused stagnation in foreign language testing. We can name another reason of lowering interest to foreign languages. It's pragmatism, philosophy dominant in the United States in the first quarter of the 20th century. Based on the principle that the usefulness, workability, and practicality of ideas, policies, and proposals are the criteria of their merit. The Second World War, the third decade of the period, was influenced by war. The First World War had been a vital catalyst for testing boom in 1920s. The impact of the Second World War on foreign languages or on foreign language teaching proved to be no less dramatic. World War II illuminated the need for a focus on training and testing listening and speaking ability. An Army specialized training program was created to offer instruction in several areas, including languages, with emphasis on oral communication. In the early 1940s, Walter Kolfers outlined a methodology for evaluating reading, listening, and speaking language abilities, including rating criteria, thus moving toward formalized military and government language testing. And the next one, toward the end of the war, the testing branch of the Armed Forces Institute issued a series of standardized tests of such things as French grammar, reading, comprehension, and vocabulary. These tests were not a success and were severely criticized by the reviewers. The World War II showed the need for oral testing. Grammar translation method-based testing was replaced by testing practices based on theories of structuralist linguistics and clearly framed by Robert Lado. The next one. So, moving on to the next period, I'd like to remind you that the 1950s saw the creation of applied linguistics as a discipline. A concrete manifestation of this was the setting up of the Center for Applied Linguistics in 1959. For the first time in the history of foreign languages testing, a theory was suggested to explain what was being attempted in practice. This theory was founded on ideas associated with structuralist linguistics and characterized by the belief that languages should be seen as independent structures studied through analysis of their component parts. Structural linguistics applied to the classroom produced audiolingualism. Its teaching practices and learning theories rooted to a large extent in behaviorist models of learning. Learning was thought to follow the stimulus-response pattern, with repetition and practice leading to new habits in language behavior. It was Robert Leyden who applied structuralism in a systematic way to language testing. Between 1946 and 1958, Leyden and his colleagues in the English Language Institute produced some of the best-known early tests of the period. They are okay. This is the list of tests. These tests and the TOEFL test, which was later modeled on them, exemplified Leyden's theory of language testing. They were objective paper and pencil tests and targeted a student's problems, essentially those of the major points of contrast between a learner's first language and his target language. The task of the tester is to find those problems and test them. This was the contrastive language hypothesis, and it was problematic to base on it, devising tests for students from different language backgrounds. Leyden himself recognized this dilemma, considering it unrealizable, except for a few major languages. Well, his phrase, a practical solution to this problem may be that of keeping separate norms for the various national groups of students that take the tests. Later, this practical solution was found in a unilingual basis of tests construction, that is, on an assessment of some of the major problems generally involved in learning English. There were many other similar tests. By the early 1960s, it had become clear that there was a need for English language proficiency tests. In May 1961, an international conference on testing the English proficiency of foreign students was held in Washington. And the major recommendations of this conference led to the initiation of TOEFL program under David Harris in 1963. One of the most illuminating contributions to the conference was made by the psychologist John Carroll, who stressed the importance of both a discrete and integrative approach in the specification of language proficiency. The test was originally developed at the Center for Applied Linguistics under the direction of Stanford University professor Charles Ferguson, and was first administered in 1964. The TOEFL test today is the most widely respected English language test in the world, recognized by more than 9,000 colleges, universities, and agencies in more than 130 countries, and therefore deserves separate consideration. The roots of one more extremely influential test, the oral proficiency interview, also go into the period we are considering. Oral language testing was an important part of the pre-scientific testing, though judged intuitively, and is now a central feature of postmodern testing. But it presented special challenges for psychometric approaches, especially the establishment of technical reliability. In language testing history, pride of place for a direct measure of oral language proficiency is generally now granted to the oral interview created by the Foreign Service Institute of the United States State Department. In the 1950s, as a war with Japan was followed by a war in Korea, the lack of preparation in modern languages was recognized as a serious problem. In 1952, the Civil Service Commission was directed to elicit the language ability of government employees. the Foreign Service Institute began to work on solving the problem under the leadership of their dean, Dr. Henry Lee Smith. The developers considered themselves pioneers working in virgin territory. They chose an interview format to ensure that all factors were tested and devised standardized factors for scoring, which reduced subjectivity. This innovation created the framework for checking interpreter reliability. It resulted in a high degree of consistency in scoring. The interview soon became the standard method of testing at FSI. In 1958, language proficiency tests became mandatory for all Foreign Service officers. In 1968, several agencies corporately wrote formal descriptions of the base levels of 4 skills: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Based on them, in the 1980s, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages developed and published for academic use the proficiency guidelines. ACTFL also developed a well-known oral proficiency interview similar to the government test and began training educators to test according to their scales. Now let's move on to the 1970s, which in many ways stand as a high point in the history of foreign language testing, when interest turned toward the creation of integrative tests in opposition to the discrete point philosophy of the previous period. Integrative testing uses items which combine many kinds of knowledge, like in realistic language use, such as dictation, speaking, and listening. Typical tasks included essay writing and an oral interview. These tests may reflect natural linguistic behavior more accurately and feature a more appropriate theoretic approach. The problem was that such integrative tests tended to be expensive, as they were time-consuming and difficult to score, requiring trained raters, and in any case, they were potentially unreliable. Research carried out by John Oller seemed to offer a solution. Oller pointed out that natural languages are systems that use more devices to communicate than are necessary. And to know a language is in some way to know its redundancies. For Oller and his associates, one of the characteristics of language competence was the ability to use redundancy, to guess the uncomprehended elements and to predict what is to follow. Borrowing a concept from John Carroll, Oller called this an expectant grammar. The tests constructed on the basis of this theory he termed pragmatic tests. In the development of pragmatic testing in the 1970s, no format received more attention than cloze test. John Oller initiated a large number of studies on the topic on cloze testing. Comparisons of scores on cloze tests with results on general batteries such as TOEFL showed high correlation, so it was concluded that cloze tests measured not only reading ability but also overall proficiency, and did it quite simply and economically. Of course, there was an inconsistency in this because in the 1970s, such tests as TOEFL were discrete point, which cloze theorists rejected. Further investigations show that cloze tests measure almost the same as discrete point tests on grammar and vocabulary, though not all the researchers share this opinion. Most of modern integrative foreign language tests contain discrete point tasks, and they could be replaced with more simple and economical cloze tests. The communicative period is the next finally, I'd like to take a look at the last period, communicative. From the early 1970s, a new theory of language use began to influence language teaching and potentially testing. This was the theory of communicative competence introduced by Delheims. His original idea was that speakers of a language have to have more than grammatical competence in order to be able to communicate effectively in a language. They also need to know how language is used by members of a speech community to accomplish their purposes. So communicative language tests were supposed to be performance tests and pay attention to the social roles candidates were likely to assume in their world settings. The second of these features distinguishes communicative language tests from the integrative pragmatic testing tradition. Various writers have tried to specify the component parts of communicative competence in foreign languages in order to provide a comprehensive framework for test development and testing research, and the basis for the interpretation of test performance. Among them were Michael, Kenal, and Merrill Swain, who divided general language competence into 4 sub-competencies: grammatical, strategic, discourse, and social linguistics. Next, their concept was elaborated by Lyle Bachman in 1990 and revised by Bachman and Palmer in 1996. Their model holds that general language knowledge consists of 2 subdomains: organizational knowledge, including grammatical and textual knowledge on the one hand, and pragmatic knowledge, including functional and social linguistic knowledge on the other. Today, this model is often used as a basis for test construction in the United States. Not only developments in language theory cause language testing evolution, rapid developments in computer technology have had a major impact on test delivery. Many important national and international tests are moving to computer-based testing or internet-based testing, and we can expect many further rapid advances in this field with direct application to testing. Well, that brings us to the end of my presentation. Just to summarize, I'd like to emphasize the main points. Testing in language education has a long tradition in the United States. Actually, there has never been a time in the history of US educational institutions without some forms of assessment. Each of the periods of language testing history had its dominating testing school, which tried to supplant the previous one for the reason of better understanding of the nature of language proficiency and verbal behavior. Changes in testing methods were also determined by the historical and cultural factors. However, old methods of testing don't disappear. They often continue to exist in modified forms, and many of the testing techniques associated with different periods remain in use today. Historically, analyzing language testing, we see that what we do today is specifically rooted in the past. Understanding this can add perspective on how we examine current events and testing practices. We do not need to continually reinvent the wheel. We should always start with what history tells us. There is no incontestable evidence that modern foreign language tests measure the level of proficiency more accurately than those of Carroll, Lado, or Oller, as we still cannot with certainty give an answer to the main question raised by Spolsky in the 1980s. What does it mean to know a language? The question is a valid one for further investigation by language detectives, and its results will influence language testing practices and cause progress. Finally, I'd like to mention that my research wouldn't have been possible without the help of many people. I would like to thank Professor Irina Tsaturova for inviting me to the world of language testing and supervising my first steps in it. Thanks are also due to my advisors, Dan Douglas and Carol Chappell from Iowa State University, and Lyle Bachman from UCLA for help in gathering the material for my research during my 3-month visit to the United States. And I want to thank you for your attention.
The English Teaching Department would like to express our appreciation for Professor Baluyan's talk. Let me remind you that at the end of the presentations, we'll hold a plenary session in which you will be able to ask questions or comments to any of our speakers. Now, I invite you to share some beverages outside of the room, and we'll come back in 15 minutes for our third presentation. Thank you very much.
No, no, no. María.
Porque como trabajando en silencio mismo. Claro. Sí, ¿cachai?
Welcome back, everyone. Our third presenter, María Moreno, is a lecturer in applied linguistics at the English Department of the University of Granada in Spain, as well as the Vice Dean for International Relations at the School of Arts and Humanities of the same university. She holds 2 MAs and a PhD on applied linguistics from the University of Granada. Her main areas of interest include lexicology and phraseology, EFL, corpus linguistics, and especially its application to ELT, and CALL, computer-assisted language learning. She has published and co-published articles on all these areas in journals such as CALL and ReCALL, and has co-edited a number of books and special issues in fields of applied linguistics. She's a member of the research project GEA, where she's in charge of the development of teaching materials based on parallel corpora of parliamentary discourse. Please, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Jaén.
Well, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Is it fine if I don't wear these micro? Because I hate them. So if I can do without them, I'll be happy. So I want to thank, first of all, the Universidad Santo Tomás for inviting me to be here today with you, and also to the authorities in this university, but very, very particularly to your professors, Anita G. Willy, and I know your name better than your surname, and Professor Sangüesa, Cristian Sangüesa, for their kindness and their generosity in this invitation and everything else. You're very lucky, all right, to have them as your professors. So I'm going to talk about collocations, learning collocations with corpora, so corpus-based language teaching in online environments. And my first thing is a question for you. Do you all know what collocations are? So that I make sure we all know what I'm talking about. Yes? What are collocations? Can anybody just tell me what it is? In a few words. What's a collocation? Words that are together. Alright. They are combinations of words that we produce in an arbitrary way, which means that there's no real reason why we should prefer that combination of words as compared to other combinations which are theoretically equally valid but which are never used by native speakers. So I think it's not even necessary to give you an example because you seem to be quite knowledgeable in the field. So brilliant. All right. So my starting point, my assumption is that teaching collocation should be a top priority in every language course. All right. And the reason for this is that they are very important. Okay, they are very frequent. Actually, Chuck and other authors say that even 80% of the language we use is prefabricated. We don't create language anew every time we speak, as Noam Chomsky said. Now we all know Chomsky was wrong. All right? So language is pre-fabricated, as I said, and therefore, if they are so frequent, and particularly within prefabricated chunks, collocations are the lion's share. So we need to pay attention to them, and particularly our students' attention. All right? Then, because they are stored as ready-made chunks in our memory, they obviously promote fluency because we go faster when we speak, and they promote accuracy because we don't choose the combinations of words, and we cannot be wrong in our selection of words because we are storing the combinations as a whole. All right. So, if we all agree on this, as we clearly do, we would expect collocations to be well established already in language teaching. But, as probably you have experienced, both as learners and as teachers, this is not the case, all right? If you have a look at teaching materials, textbooks, you clearly see that collocations are not really very present, and therefore they are not, and obviously they are not predominant in teaching materials. So something needs to be done. This is evidence, statistical evidence of what I'm saying. All right, we carried out pilot study with our students, with our English university students and translation students in Spain, and you know, the green bar represents receptive knowledge of collocations, and the red bar represents productive knowledge of collocations, and neither of them reaches the minimum 50%, which would mean passing the test. So our students, our university students, collocational competence was really poor, and therefore we realized something had to be done, all right? And this is what I'm going to explain to you, what we did, okay? What I did was action research. I don't know if you're familiar with this research paradigm, but the thing is that this is the traditional way of representing it in a circular arrangement, and it is very good as a research method because it is teachers doing research in their own classroom with their own students. So checking what is really useful for their own students, all right? And this is what we did. We'll go step by step, all right? So first, we identified the problem, as I already explained, and we established our hypothesis as a starting point. And the hypothesis basically is that if collocations are so important, and considering that our students clearly have problems in learning them and using them, we need to do something. And we believe that a corpus-based pedagogical treatment to teach frequent collocations should be useful. This is the hypothesis we wanted to put to the test. For doing that, we designed a pedagogical treatment, all right? It was formed with a twofold purpose. First of all, from a more general perspective, what we wanted to do was to make our students autonomous learners of their own collocations. As teachers, I'm sure you know that what you need to do is not to teach, to give your students fish, but to teach them how to fish on their own. I'm happy to see that you're familiar with this idea. So this is exactly what we wanted to do. It's not just teaching collocations only, but teaching them how to learn collocations on their own. All right? So the first point is this, and the second point is actually teaching collocations, improving their collocational knowledge, as we were doing this. And for this, we followed two steps. First, we selected the contents, what collocations to teach, and then how to teach it, all right? You know that when you're planning any kind of pedagogical instruction, you need to think of what to teach, the contents, and how to teach it, the methodology, all right? So, for the first point, I designed a list of frequent collocations with corpus-based materials. This was a lot of work, and to cut it short and not to make it too complicated, if you are really interested in corpus-based techniques, I can explain later on to you what the technicalities were, but just to give you the main idea of what I did, I, of course, could not focus on all collocations in English, so I had to focus on a particular kind of collocations, which in this case were noun collocations, because to me and to many others I've read, we build information and meaning up around nouns. Nouns carry the main semantic load in the information we convey. So I thought collocations based on nouns were the best point to start with. All right. So I focus on adjective, noun, verb, noun, and verb collocations. And I first selected the base, the main word in the combination, which is the independent word, the word you start with. And then once I had my list of bases, I searched for the collocates, for the companions of those bases. All right? Because in a combination of words in a collocation, you have a base and a collocate. One is the independent main word, and the other one is the collocate, which is restricted by the, or pre-required, if you want, by the base. So for the bases, for the first point, for the first step, my list of bases were 412 most frequent words of English, most frequent nouns of English. All right. I said it was a huge study. All right. And where did these 412 nouns come from? Well, they were taken from a frequency list of words compiled by one of our colleagues at the University of Granada, who is called María Moreno. She did a very good piece of research in 2005, collecting a frequency list of words, of general words, based on the four most reliable frequency lists available today, which are based on the Bank of English, the British National Corpus, and the London Corpus Network. All right, and I selected. She compared and combined the information from all these corpora and all these frequency lists, and she designed a 7,000 word count. All right, so she collected the first 7,000 words of the language, and I took the nouns out of the first 1,000 words of this list. All right, so I was working with the 412 nouns that you find in the first 1,000 words of English. Okay? Fine. And then once I had my list of nouns, I had to select the collocates for those nouns. And to do that, I had to take two steps. First, I conducted an automatic extraction. So I used corpus-based techniques to extract automatically collocates from the BNC, the British National Corpus, and the BOE, the Bank of English. All right, and because machines cannot think for ourselves yet, I had to complement my initial automatic search with some manual work using my head to improve the selection made by the machine. All right, and for this manual selection, I had to clean the initial results I obtained automatically from the machine by using these criteria, just to make sure that the actual collocations that I had obtained were real collocations and nothing else. So, of course, I was obtaining from the machine, I was obtaining combinations such as read, book. But to read a book is not a collocation, it's a free combination of words because there is no arbitrariness in the combination. So I deleted combinations such as read, book. I obtained things like blind eye, which obviously stands for to turn a blind eye on something, which is not a collocation but an idiom. So I also deleted it because it was not compositional. So in other words, it was not literal, it was figurative, and therefore it was not a collocation. Then I found things like fast food, which is not a collocation but a compound. All right, and where is the boundary between a collocation and a compound? Well, I was sleeping and dreaming of this for a long time, and I think semantics can give us an answer. And if you're interested in this, we can talk about this later on. And finally, I found things like, well, the machine found things like marginal cost, which obviously is English for specific purposes, is specific a list of general collocations, not specific, like each specific registers. Alright, so I deleted this. So the result of all these huge amount of work was tables, an awful long table like this, where I had the nouns, and then I had the collocates from the Bank of English and the ones from the British National Corpus. I compared the results from both corpora, and I obtained my final list of collocations with more than 2,600 collocations. This is, they are the most frequent collocations in English, all right? And the list is online, is available. If you're really interested in having the list, both as learners of English, that we are all learners of English, and also as teachers of English, I'll be more than happy to share it with you, all right? So if you're interested, just email me or something, and I'll send you the list, okay? So, once I had my collocations, I moved to the second step. I wanted to teach some of those 2,000 and something collocations, and I designed the activities. All right, and I did this in the online course that we have that we used to have until 1 year ago in Granada, which is called Adelex. All right, and which is a course for an online course for improving our students' knowledge of lexis, the lexical competence. And within lexis, we include collocations. All right. This is the way the course looked like a few years ago in the Ilias platform. Now, or the latest version was in the Moodle platform, which I'm sure you are familiar with. All right, and as I said, the course was removed from the program a year ago by our intelligent authorities in Granada. All right, and well, the pedagogical framework followed the recommendations by Paul Nation, who is the man who knows most in the world for vocabulary teaching, for second language vocabulary teaching. All right, if you want to know something about how to teach vocabulary, you need to read Paul Nation. All right, and he says that for a teaching program to be efficient in vocabulary, you need to follow these 4 steps, and this is what we do. Okay. So as to the introduction, well, if it is necessary to introduce anything you teach to your students, this is more so in the case of collocations, because they tend to go unnoticed by them. They are not as eye-catching as idioms. If you see an idiom as a second language learner, when you see an idiom, it catches your eye and you pay attention to it, even without actually realizing it. But if you read a collocation, you never ever pay attention to it because you understand it, because it's not figurative, it is literal. So you understand it, so you just keep reading or you keep listening and you don't actually focus on it. And therefore, students don't even know what a collocation is. They don't know they exist until someone tells them that they do, all right, and how important they are. So they assume that the word is the basic unit in vocabulary, and they assume that if you follow your grammatical and your semantic rules, you can combine words as you wish. Okay, so you really need to introduce the idea of collocations to challenge their preconception of freedom in combination of words, right? And also, you need to explain the very idea of collocation, which is not easy to explain. It took me months, alright, until I finally got my definition of collocation. For these are some of the activities that I designed. For instance, I start by asking my students, alright, we all know the word night, we all know the word use, we all know the word need. Good. Now tell me how to say tengo una necesidad imperiosa in English. And they say, well, imperious means, and it doesn't work. All right. Or okay, you know the word uso, use. Now tell me how to say darle un buen uso a algo. And they say to give a good use, and you just say it in English. All right. So I start to challenge their pre-assumptions or their assumptions, all right? And then I ask them, well, I give them some reading, short reading, so that they know what a collocation is, basically. And then I ask them to check whether some combinations exist in English or not, and whether they correspond to the Spanish version. So in Spanish, well, and I learned yesterday that in Chilean Spanish you don't say very often poner un ejemplo. You usually say dar un ejemplo, because you're influenced by English. Because in English they don't put an example, they give an example. So that's why you say dar un ejemplo. But in Spain, we never say, or very rarely we say dar un ejemplo. Ponemos ejemplos. Alright, so I tell them, does it work to you? The same for plantear un problema, to pose a problem. Do you say that in English or not? Or terminar una guerra, do you finish a war or do you end a war? So I check, I ask the students to check this with corpora, right, with concordances. And as you can see, I strongly believe in translation for doing this. And this is something I wanted to emphasize, all right? This is a point I want to make. I strongly believe in translation, and I think it's just a pity that a misunderstanding of communicative approaches has made us believe that there's no room for translation in a communicative, real, modern and trendy classroom, all right? Because we tend to believe that translation is related to grammar translation methods, is tradition, is old-fashioned and is useless. Well, I think there is a simplification, it's an oversimplification, which is definitely wrong for the teaching of collocations. The moment you start to compare Spanish and English versions and collocations, you realize that you need to learn them as a whole, and